Gertrude. Thank you very much for inviting me today, and thank you to the BC History of Nursing and also the Consortium for Nursing History that Gertrude just talked about. And also in the room, particular people that really helped me through the dissertation, Sheila Rankin-Zerg, Glenys Zilm, Ethel Warbenek, and of course Gertrude again. And Gertrude was my master's supervisor at the University of Calgary. So thank you very much. I'm going to present what feels like a very brief overview of a very long dissertation. So I hope that it flows together somehow, but just to let you know that, it is an overview, and I hope we have time for questions maybe at the end. Okay. So I would like to start with giving you a description of the dissertation, the process, participants, some of the methodology, some of the major findings and conclusions. So for this dissertation, I interviewed 37 women who became nurses between 1958 and 1977 in Calgary and Vancouver. This period represents a pivotal time in the development of the publicly funded healthcare system, a dramatic increase in women's involvement in the paid labor force, as well as labor organizations, and also a period that I closed with, which was the closing of the last residential school of nursing in Calgary involved with in my study. So analysis of the interviews provides, oh, that's it, I have to use the glasses, sorry. I'm not used to this, okay, sorry. Analysis of these interviews provides a challenge to the dominant historiography that suggests that hospital-based programs were sites of unusual social and moral regulation, and that nursing was a career choice that women made because they lacked other more challenging or rewarding alternatives. In making these claims, I position hospital-based programs and nursing in these decades instead as a form of women's labor that exemplified employed women's struggles to promote fairer wages, better working conditions, and as an education credential that opened unusual and largely unavailable opportunities for women's access to higher education and professional status. So the following presentation provides an overview of the focus of my research, including the research design, methodology, major findings, and conclusions. Women who became nurses in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s are the majority of nurses, educators, and nurse leaders in Canada today. Many of these women will retire in the next 10 years. These nurses will also be among the first cohort of women who will experience the social and economic benefits of their own employment-based pensions. They will also be among the first generation of women to contribute to combine a professional career with marriage and motherhood. According to nursing and labor historian Mark Roth, the early education and career experiences of these women reflect a time when, quote, for women, the professional career presented a contradiction. While public service was an acceptable pursuit, women's primary role was still in the domestic sphere. Nursing was to be a middle-class profession, but an inherently gendered one, defined by obedience to male doctors, female virtue, caring, sacrifice, and lower wages. Although gender dynamics have changed and assumptions about women's subservience have been challenged, nursing remains a gendered profession. It continues to be defined primarily as a woman's caring profession, and thus it is easy to make assumptions that because the majority of nurses are women, there is homogeneity in why women chose nursing and how they understand nursing work. In contrast, the stories of 37 women who entered nursing in the 1960s and 70s revealed that the association of women with caring was an important consideration, but not the only reason they chose this profession. Race, class, sexuality, and religion were also influential in shaping individual and collective choices, limitations, and experiences. I'd like to talk a little bit about my position as a researcher. Many of the women I work with at the University of Victoria have told me stories about their nursing education and early experiences in the profession. And these stories resonated with the stories of the women I interviewed. When I met most of my colleagues, they were well advanced in their careers. Many had shared a common journey from frontline nurses to nurse leader, returning to graduate school, and finally entering doctoral studies and teaching primarily. The majority, like my participants, had also married, born children, and stayed in touch with various alumni associations, reflecting the close personal bonds they formed during their early days in the residential hospital-based programs. In contrast, I entered in a diploma school of nursing at the age of 40 in 1994, and I completed my baccalaureate degree by distance at UBC. I immediately entered graduate school and began teaching in the final year of my master's program at the University of Calgary. I moved back to the West Coast, and while teaching at the University of Victoria, completed my PhD in June of last year. In contrast to my colleagues, I had had none of the shared experiences of living in residence, frontline nursing, marriage, motherhood, unionization, or adjustment to the dual roles of being a mother and professional in early adulthood. I was intrigued that although I was of similar age and academic credential, my experience of becoming a nurse and my reason for choosing nursing were very different than theirs. I wondered how their common experiences might have shaped nursing education and nursing practice in particular ways over the intervening decades. I hope that understanding some of the commonalities, but also differences in the experience of these women during these important decades in women's labor history might provide a new angle of reflection on current issues and debates within the profession. I'd like to briefly talk about some of the literature that I reviewed for my study. I began researching my study by reviewing what had been written about nursing in the early post-war period, particularly the rationale for closing the hospital-based schools. I reviewed, for example, a number of important documents, including the Weir Report in 1932 and the two major reports on nursing and nursing education compiled by Dr. Helen Musalem in the early 1960s. I also reviewed other important reports on the status of women in these decades, such as the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, written in the 1960s. I accessed through a number of school archives advertisements for schools of nursing promoting college and university-based programs, as well as scholarly articles written by proponents of the baccalaureate degree. In general, these sources represented the three-year hospital-based programs as the dark ages of nursing education, the so-called horse and buggy years, according to a brochure compiled for high school counselors promoting the new college-based programs in the 1960s. I found, however, that the experiences of the women I interviewed who graduated during these so-called dark ages complicated this evaluation. And here I'm also including the UBC program, which was also a hospital-based program, even though the conditions of education were different than the three-year diploma. In fact, I would argue that women who became nurses in the early post-war period have made a unique contribution to women's education and labor history that is yet to be fully recognized. Now, an overview of the research methodology and design. In this study, analysis of the interview data was guided by three methodological approaches: oral history, feminism, and Foucault's conceptualization of governmentality. Briefly, oral history. Catherine Haynes explains that oral history allows individual subjectivity and experience to be central to the empirical data. Similarly, nursing is a practice lived through relationships with others, and understanding the lived experience of the individual is central to the nurse's ability to promote and facilitate the well-being of the other. In oral history, as in nursing, the interview process is a shared experience that occurs between individuals, with the interviewer having a particular purpose in mind. In this study, the purpose of the interview was to understand the experiences of women who entered nursing in Canada between 1958 and 1977. For these reasons, key questions asked of each interviewee were, why did you desire to become a nurse? How did society's expectations of you as a woman influence your experience of being a nurse? What was the experience of being a young woman in nursing in these decades? And what other factors were significant in shaping your experience of being a nurse? Finally, I asked, what meaning do you now make of the experiences that you had during this period? A second methodological approach was feminism. A feminist perspective is often thought to privilege particular power relations based on gender. While gender is an important consideration, I would argue that gender is not the only lens of feminist analysis in nursing history. Catherine McPherson has identified the influence of gender, but she also includes class and ethnicity as defining the major social and political positions in which nursing has unfolded. McPherson argues the mutual, if not always equal, influences of class, gender, and ethnicity need to be considered together in order to explain nurses' position within the healthcare system and to understand nurses' strategies to improve that position. Thus, in analyzing the interview data, I've employed a feminist perspective that includes the intersecting influences of class, gender, ethnicity, and religion. This more intersectional perspective allowed me to form a more complex understanding of how the lived experiences of women's lives is both personal and contextual, both subjectively and discursively shaped by shifting and overlapping markers of identity that include but are not defined by gender. Finally, the third methodological approach in this study is informed by the work of Michel Foucault. Foucault uses the term governmentality to describe those intersecting historical processes whose complex web of actions and effects are directed at the maintenance of a particular social order and particular power relations. The concept of power relations is central to understanding how governmentality works as an instrument of control to direct social relations. For Foucault, power is always relational and circulates in all directions. It is not merely a force for top-down oppression. Power is an instrument used by and upon individuals that has effects on both. David Holmes and Denise Gastaldo explain that power operates through networks of organizations, communication, and institutional systems such as government, healthcare, religion, and education. As power is exercised upon individuals, they in turn exert power on others. Holmes and Gastaldo note that nurses constitute and make feasible the institutions and systems that they believe are the sources of their oppression. This conformity to and resistance against institutions and systems of power is a central feature in the stories told by my participants. Now, very briefly, I would like to tell you a little bit about the participants. The women who participated in this study graduated from 7 different schools of nursing in Calgary, Alberta, and Vancouver, British Columbia. All attended hospital-based programs, including those who graduated from the University of British Columbia School of Nursing. 36 of the 37 women were between the ages of 16 and 19 when they entered nursing school. One was 20 years old. All graduated within 3, 4, or 5 years of entering their program, depending on whether they attended the 3-year diploma program or the 4 or 5-year UBC program. All the women interviewed entered nursing school within 2 years of high school graduation and were practicing nurses within 2 years of graduating from their nursing program. So I'd like to say a little bit about the sources of my the sources for the dissertation. The primary sources of data for this study are the 37 oral interviews with the women who obtained their nursing education. I chose in Calgary and Vancouver. I chose these two cities and schools of nursing in order to focus on two close but distinct locations. Vancouver and Calgary are two Western Canadian cities close to the Canada-US border. Both are surrounded by rural farmland, and both were reliant on a resource-based economy during the period under study. Both cities had similar hospital-based programs, although Vancouver had established a School of Nursing in 1919 at the University of British Columbia. Additional primary sources included archival records of the schools of nursing and reports about nursing education from professional associations such as the CNA Journal, popular media, and publications such as the Weir and Masalem reports. Secondary sources included selections in the history of feminism, nursing, and labor, and women's history in Canada and the United States, as well as literature related to the histories of professionalism, unionism, the family, and religion. Three dominant themes emerged from the analysis of the interviews. These three themes were desiring nursing, the hospital-based programs. This theme focused on what attracted women to nursing. Second, nursing and working motherhood. This theme examined the relationship between working as a nurse while also being a mother. And finally, nursing, unionization, and professionalization. This theme considered the overlapping and sometimes contradictory aims of nurses as they sought improvements in wages and working conditions, while also maintaining and promoting the so-called new professional image of the nurse. The following section, I'll present an overview of the analysis of these three themes. The first is desiring nursing, hospital-based programs. Karen, a graduate of St. Paul's Hospital School of Nursing in 1961, explained to me that from the time I was very young, I always wanted to be a nurse. And I guess there was a caregiver part of me that just wanted to do that. And I followed that through, and I always knew. I didn't ever go from side to side and change my idea. I wanted to be a nurse, and I followed everything along the way, and that was what I did. And I was always happy that I did go into nursing, because that's who I was. Closely aligned with the attraction to nursing was the image of nursing as a professional career, the limited availability of other forms of professional employment, and the availability of low cost of hospital-based training programs. Nursing was portrayed as an occupation for unmarried and in some cases married women that conferred authority and social acceptability. Nursing uniforms often reflected current fashion trends. Nurses had a degree of economic independence that was unusual for women at this time. And they also had a different kind of relationship with men in authority, doctors in particular, that conveyed an unusual level of collegiality between genders for this time period. The independence of the nursing residents was also attractive. In the hospital-based diploma programs, students lived in residences attached to the hospital for 3 years and could not be married or live out of residence. For young unmarried women, living away from home was unusual, and these arrangements offered a degree of independence from parental supervision that some women found attractive. The low cost of nursing education and the guarantee of employment was also attractive to young women and their families when funds for a girl's education and opportunities for respectable employment were scarce. Shelley, graduate of the Calgary General Hospital School of Nursing in 1966, remembered, "Back in the 60s, times were hard, and nursing seemed to be an avenue that was not very costly. In fact, it was very minimal what we had to pay for. They, my parents, could see that it was a good career and developed a lot of qualities in us that they felt were desirable, like honesty and maybe some leadership roles, learning how to pass and finish and complete a task, and discipline." Similarly, Mona, a graduate of the Calgary General in 1967, recalled, "In those days, of course, women didn't have great choices about what they could do, even in school. My dad was a mechanic. I loved mechanics, but we couldn't take mechanics as an option. We could only take sewing and cooking and traditional stuff. And then, so going into university, of course, there were two factors. Number one, not great choices for women. Again, in university, and the second thing was my family didn't have a lot of money, and it only cost $100 to get into nursing, compared to going to university, which was going to be much more expensive." For some middle-class families, nursing was one of the only professional schools at the university level that facilitated women's career advancement. Kelly, who graduated from the UBC School of Nursing in 1967, remembered, "When I graduated from university, people were banging on my door to work with them. There was a real shortage of nurses then. I could have worked anywhere. They hired me on the spot from the classroom at UBC. Nobody was without a job. I found myself a head nurse on the psych unit within the fall of 1969, 2 years after graduation. Then, at the tender age of 26 or so, with very limited experience, I became assistant director of nurses at a regional hospital." The second theme, nursing and working motherhood. As Dora, a graduate of the UBC School of Nursing, remembered, "I think my children probably thought that I was just a little worky. I'm a little worky at home and I'm a little worky at the hospital," they thought. "My daughter was very surprised," she said, "when we first went to the hospital where I was working. And she said, 'You went behind the desk at the nursing station.' People came to see me in the job as a resource. They're always coming and asking questions. I'm always doing things for the staff." She was surprised that people would come to me and that so many people knew me and so many people would use me as a resource. "I didn't think the kids at that time had any idea that their mom had a fairly significant role in the hospital." The women interviewed in this study came of age and became nurses, wives, and mothers as part of a generation known as the baby boomers. It was during their growing up years after the Second World War, as Tina Black and Mona Gleason explain, that Canadians struggled to reestablish what was considered the social stability, quote, of the white Christian family in the face of changing assumptions about women's total commitment to marriage and motherhood. Nurses, like many other women, were also undergoing change in their relationship to work, marriage, and motherhood. Rather than being passive targets for this change process, as has been described in some histories of nursing, women in this study told stories that revealed a more complex picture. In this transitional period, women were becoming essential to the expanding consumer economy, both as producers of goods and consumers of goods. Simultaneously, their primary role as wives and mothers continued to be governed by discourses of domestic responsibilities such as housework and childcare. Shelley, a graduate of the Calgary General in 1966, reflected on how she wrestled with such issues as how or whether to combine work, marriage, and motherhood. She explained, "Well, back when I was first starting to be a homemaker and mother, home values were important. Mother had a role to play. That is what mother should be, whatever. And I don't know if being a full-time employee was on that list. Not likely, right? That mindset that mother's place is in the home. But as time goes on and our cost of living in society whether they dictate that you should have this or that, you need this or you need that, or this or that, well, let's face it. How are you going to pay for it on one person's salary? Nursing also allowed women to escape from motherhood. Gina, a graduate of the Calgary General in 1964, recalled that she had been working full-time until her first child was born in 1979. Gina returned to full-time work after 6 months, although she did not need to work. I thought that staying at home with my child when he was born in 79 I was just looking at women who were at home on my street with their children, and I thought, this is going to be lovely. I could hardly wait. And although it was hard to go back to work and leave him with the home care provider, I didn't like being at home because I didn't feel accomplished. I look back on it now and I think, you know, what if? But that's just the way I was. I still think I was a good mother, but I wasn't willing to give up a certain lifestyle. I could say that would be part of it, and I felt so much fulfillment at work. Similarly, Dinah, a graduate of the Calgary General in 1964, described the summer she decided to stay home as a full-time mom as somewhat less than rewarding. I was never one of those people that would do well at home. I didn't fit in with being a housewife, and I didn't know that myself until, for instance, one time when my youngest was 4 years old, I went to the director of nursing and I said, I think I'm going to take a couple of months off this summer and I'm going to seriously think about quitting work. At the end of 2 months, I'm not kidding, it rained that whole summer. Every time I blew up the rubber ducky to go and take the kids swimming, it rained. It was a terrible summer, and that's when I knew that I wasn't able to do it. I wouldn't quit work. Not everyone interviewed felt successful at combining paid work and unpaid caregiving. Rona's experience in 1965 suggests how dominant gendered attitudes had not died. She explains, I married a fellow in the mid-60s who did not want me to work, but I did. It was very important to me. I'd worked hard to get my RN, and I worked a year, and then I had my first baby, and I always worked, but he didn't want me to work. And in order to work, I had to do everything at home. The meal was ready for the evening. Anything the kids needed was organized, so it wasn't easy, but that's what I did to keep him happy. It was hard. Some of it was hard, and I was tired. And I'd get home. I usually worked the afternoon shifts, so I'd get home at midnight. And I might have to be up with the kids at night, and still to be up in the morning. So there was never any, wow, you really did a great job, or you must be tired. That was never any of it. Unionization and professionalization is the third theme. Wanda, a graduate of the Vancouver General in 1969, remembered working hard after the birth of her first child in 1970. I remember working evenings and weekends in labor and delivery. I suspect it was part-time, and let me tell you how horrible it was being a breastfeeding mother going back to work in those days. Because it was so busy, I'd sit in the john on the toilet, eating my sandwich and pumping my breasts. That was the only facility there was, and of course, nobody breastfed in those days. I was all alone, and when I had to work late, overtime, the whole front of my scrub suit would be soggy with milk. Regardless of how much seniority she had, if a nurse resigned for any reason, including childbearing, she started at the bottom of the seniority list when she returned to work. When maternity leave was granted, it was short and conditional, often only a month in duration. Having made the choice to work or having been compelled to work by necessity, the majority of women experienced working conditions that reflected their low social status and the low value placed on their work. Like other women, nurses faced low wages, overwork, strict policies of dress and deportment, long shifts and split shifts, dangerous working conditions including sexual harassment and verbal and physical abuse, as well as a lack of seniority, lack of pensions, and maternity benefits. As women struggled to combine work, marriage, and motherhood, the advantages of unionization came to represent the strongest option for addressing workplace concerns. Audrey, a graduate of the Holy Cross School of Nursing in 1964, remembered what difference the unions made. I think it came in the early 80s, I'm pretty sure. I think that nurses just saw the need for better working conditions. We really were pushed around a lot in terms of our hours. We weren't being paid properly, and I think there was a real need for it. And it did a good job for us. Now, there were times when, I'm not really a union person, and there were times when I would get quite angry at what they were demanding. On the whole, I think the unions improved our lot. Suzanne Gordon has argued that it was not always or only the so-called self-serving desire for better wages that motivated nurses to form and join unions. Benefits related to maternity and childcare were also an issue and improved as a result of union involvement. Corinne, a graduate of St. Paul's School of Nursing in 1965, remembered how nurses benefited from the labor movements of the 1960s and 70s. There was no union when I had to quit when I was pregnant. There was no maternity leave. You lost your seniority, and that was that. So there were no perks, so to speak, when it comes to nursing, right? So the union made a huge difference in that area. Increasingly, however, options for advancement in nursing, that is, opportunities for education, administration, and leadership, which meant a chance to get out of shift work and off the floor, went to nurses with a university degree. Nurses who were left on the floor were more likely to have graduated from a 3-year diploma program and be members of unions, whereas those who had a university degree were more likely to be in non-union positions. As the power and prestige of the university degree spread, nurses with a degree assumed and attempted to impose a different definition of professionalism than had previously been shared by the majority of both diploma and degree nurses. As Jana, graduate of the Calgary General in 1974, recalled when I asked her why she returned to get her degree after her diploma, she explained, "I had the boss from hell. I thought, I'm going back to school, to hell with this." I asked her, were there other reasons? She said, well, that was the main reason, but then the writing was on the wall. If you wanted to have options, you needed the degree. I loved bedside nursing, but I wanted to have options. I thought, well, if I go back to school, I will have those options. I'll be able to have some decision-making power in my life and not have to put up with people like that. So I went back and got the degree because I really wanted to teach. I thought I would be good at that. But when I finished, they had eliminated the teaching positions, but had added management positions. That's how I ended up in management. What emerged in these decades, the decades of this study, were two competing discourses. On the one hand, frontline bedside nurses, who tended to be those educated in the diploma and or hospital-based programs, sought to promote an image of professionalism based on traditions of service and altruism, while also balancing the responsibilities of marriage and motherhood. On the other hand, university-educated nurses, who were increasingly those moving into supervisory, administrative, and educational roles, sought opportunities to create and strengthen alliances within academia and to nest traditions of service and altruism within the broader definitions of professionalism established by male-dominated professions such as law and medicine. Different perspectives of professionalism also reflected class differences within nursing. These differences were expressed in the interviews and reflect broader social norms where the working class performed manual labor, for example, the tasks of bedside nursing, and those in the middle and upper classes performed managerial tasks. It is important to note, however, that unionization and professionalization are but two frameworks for presenting a very complex set of developments within nursing in these decades. As Carroll and Warburton contend, professionalization and unionization were not always at odds. Whether nurses held a diploma or degree, they were the most highly educated and highly paid professional women in the public service. Many of them, Carroll and Warburton explain, were, quote, committed to careerist progression up a ladder of achievement, prestige, and authority. Many were torn between allegiances to management and commitment to their nursing sisters and other workers. I just want to present a few conclusions or findings, I guess. There were other themes that emerged from the study that would take quite a bit of time to present. I've chosen 3 that stand out as more or less common across the interviews. Within these themes, I have attempted to present some of the nuances in the experiences between women in relation to those themes. Other important experiences related to class, race, ethnicity, religion, and sexuality are significant. However, a fuller discussion of the meaning of those experiences is beyond the scope of this presentation. In conclusion, I would argue that in this study, analysis of interviews with women who became nurses in these decades complicates the belief that women chose nursing due to a lack of more suitable or desirable alternatives, and that all nurses were devoted to the care of their patients, service to society, and obedience to gendered norms. The stories of women educated in the hospital-based programs, particularly in the residential programs, suggest a different interpretation of the so-called dark ages of nursing and contradict the assumption that young women were merely exploited as a source of cheap labor and then willingly abandoned nursing and took up their proper place as wives and mothers. Questioning assumptions about nursing, such as the value of the hospital-based programs or conflicting definitions of professionalism, serves to challenge the narrative of progress that is deeply embedded in the history of science to which nursing has a strong affiliation. Instead, stories of the women in this study suggest that nurses were politically astute in harnessing the power of unions, feminism, professional associations, and the media to achieve their multiple goals. They were not passive bystanders in the women's movement that swept the social landscape of Canada and the United States in the post-war era. Their conflicting goals and strategies created antagonistic divisions within nursing that reverberate today. And this points to the need for a more complex understanding of the social and historical context that inform current nursing education and practice models. I suggest that our current models are not necessarily the result of the relentless progress of the profession from indentured servitude to unchallenged professionalism. In this study, I chose a particular period in nursing study that many have labeled the Dark Ages to suggest that we have not necessarily emerged into a better state, and suggest rather that nursing in these decades represented a form of women's labor that exemplified employed women's struggles to obtain a useful and rewarding career. Nurses act in multiple ways that have not been previously acknowledged to promote fairer wages, better working conditions, and access to the benefits of economic citizenship in Canada for all women. As the status of university education rose in the 1960s and the need for nurses expanded along with the growth of the publicly funded healthcare system, leaders in nursing leveraged the demand for nursing, the demands of feminists for greater access to education and career opportunities, and the strength of the union movement to make the voice of nurses and women heard at multiple sites of social, economic, and political influence. The ability of nurses to maintain a prominent position in healthcare, to advocate for the conditions needed to provide the best nursing care possible, while also fighting for improved working conditions and higher professional status, is an impressive story of how women in these decades used gender and class as tools to enact social change. These efforts are all the more impressive when considered within the context of social opposition faced by nurses as they both resisted and conformed to expectations that their primary role was as wives and mothers. Nurses negotiated this challenging political terrain by framing their works in terms of its practical necessity and gendered suitability as women's paid employment. In making these claims, I position nursing and nursing education as a form of women's labor that exemplifies employed women's struggles to promote greater access to the benefits of economic and social citizenship for all women. That's it.
Now, we do have time for questions.
How long was that?
Having been a student and a teacher in that period, I found that absolutely fascinating. There's quite a few of us that were educated at that time, isn't there? Just show the hand. Yes, quite a few.
Right.
What a study.
Margaret, I just want to say thank you for all of us living in this, sitting in this room that lived this phenomenon. It's wonderful to see you take such a scholarly look at it. And oftentimes we just felt that, we were kind of just going along and doing the best we could. But we really just feel very proud of what we have in those years. Thank you.
I think I was really impressed myself, and as I said at the beginning, I had such a different experience, and I was just, so getting into the literature and interviewing women, it really showed me a different side of many of the women that I work with experience, a different interpretation than what you generally do read about that time period.
I'm actually a graduate of Holy Cross Hospital.
Ah!
So it's interesting. Now I wonder, the question I have is, I was there on a cusp of change. Okay, so my sister had been a nursing student in Saskatchewan before me, years, in the early 60s. So I was there 68 to 71, and we actually had the summers off. We did not work nights. There were all kinds of changes happening, and I wonder whether the people you interview, like your study covers that period, the difference between the generation before, perhaps, and that group.
Well, it is interesting when you talk about that time period, 68 to say 71, because enrollment in nursing schools was dropping. And part of it was because of the feminist movement, rebellion against authority. That was becoming a kind of a popular movement, and so the rigidity of the residential schools in particular wasn't very attractive when young women had other options, and the schools were forced to soften some of those rules, such as staying out late or living in residence or getting married. So there were different responses to different schools, within different schools, to that broader change in society. Lots of interesting stories about downright rebellion. One woman complained just about the rules and restrictions, and was interviewed by a radio station in Calgary about the hours that they worked. They didn't have any time off in the summer. Anyways, she was drummed out of the school. I was the Holy Cross. And then...
by Sister Letourneau.
Probably. But her classmates just wouldn't stand for it, and they all went en masse into the director of nursing and just said, no, we don't accept this. So they had to take her back. That's pretty unusual. So.
It was an interesting time. One of my classmates was a nun who was running draft dodges across the
Yeah.
didn't hear about that.
That would be a good story.
I think Joe wanted to ask.
Yes, Joan.
Yes, you have to look at me from a different viewpoint that I heard nothing about in your wonderful speech, which I really think was incredibly good. But as a graduate from 1940, and being an old tough old prairie chicken, and also the fact that I was retreaded twice and had a chance to look at it all up the line, I still think nursing has a long, long way to go. And one of its biggest problems always has been the terrible narrowness of a nurse's education from the beginning, being hired and being actually exploited because of what the hospital needs at the time really were. And then to try and move that ahead to where it had to be a woman who was something of the world and looking at it in a whole different way is still very hard and a long way to go. And I refer to it as the narrowness of a nurse's education in my era. First of all, you had no money, no time because you worked 30 days a month and all this sort of thing, which does not contribute to a person moving out into the world and contributing more on a big scale rather than on the narrow scale of being a hospital nurse who was being used. So, I mean, that kind of a study will not be, pretty soon, nobody will be able to do it because we're a dead and dying breed. I mean, you've got to find the people to ask about it.
Yeah,
They're
well, I
not
think
there.
that shows the value of oral history as a
Yes,
tool in nursing.
Oral history, writing down some of the oral history.
Yes, yeah.
You know, because this is very hard. See, you talked about things about nursing, which I think were very important. I really do. But they are still a long, long way to go. Because basically, it comes down to the fact that all human beings heal themselves, and all of us, nurses, physios, doctors, whoever, they assist that person to heal. But it is the person themselves who does the healing. And we have to face that totally and utterly, because otherwise how do we start where the important part is? But on top of that, how are we going to get to the stage where nurses are recognized? Now, I have been in many positions along the way, and it's still very hard. There's sort of still an attitude that if you don't have further education, the rest of the hospital employees or public health employees feel you're in a lower category. Oh, well, we don't need the nurse's opinion there. We'll have so-and-so and so-and-so. And this kind of attitude, and only nurses can change that. Have you ever read any of Saul Alinsky's business about, I will not do your work for you. I will teach you how to stand up for yourself. And nurses still have not come all the way on that. And also you miss one other thing that I think is probably more noticeable is money. Many nurses simply, it used to be called the poor man's daughter's career. Somebody wanted a career, it was the poor man's daughter. And we have to remember that that's important, because people who are in that position of not enough money have also a harder time to speak up.
Right.
And speak for other people. And nurses have to admit this and say, look, we can do this. But, I mean, as I say, it's very hard because people have, as you say, a million other things on their mind besides nursing. They've got to take care of their families, their grandparents, their mothers, their fathers, their children, everybody. Right. And everybody turns to a nurse. On top of that, the one thing that sometimes gets missed is that many people want to come to a nurse for help. And this is not recognized, even by the nurses themselves, that they need further information and education to be that person when somebody comes to them for help. And that gets missed out.
Well, it's
and yet it's
interesting.
very valuable, because that's what people are looking for when they're ill or when they have problems. I mean, nurses can go that other step, which I think is what eventually should come and probably will come.
Thank you.
But I'm optimistic.
Good, thank you.
Gertie, yeah.
Good.
Thanks, Margaret, for an excellent examination of that time period. And one of the questions I have is whether, based on the interviews that you did, have you had the idea that suddenly dawned on me that I don't think that is often considered, because the closure of the schools of hospital-based schools of nursing is often framed as an economic matter in many ways, eventually that it was not sustainable or feasible, in addition to the quest for education. But have you had in the discussions with these nurses had the idea that the influx of married women into the workforce in some ways made the model also unsustainable? Because I suddenly realized that in Vancouver General Hospital, they built a brand new residence like in the late 50s.
Yeah.
It opened. And then it seemed within 10 years that was outdated. Not necessarily the building, but the whole model.
Yeah.
But I was thinking that your story could probably support that married women.
And that would be another.
Is that indeed what you
Yeah, that's a really good point. And even in the Foothills Hospital, even opened in the early 70s. So that's amazing that they still had the idea that women would be going along with that.
When there was, because you mentioned the children, like did the nurses comment on that they could not, later there was no.
Yeah, and they did loosen up those residential rules, and then that whole influx of married women into nursing, but also the women's movement and the social trends of women living away from home on their own, that sort of broke down one of the reasons that young women went into those residences to get away from home. Well, then they didn't have to do that, right? So that was another reason when you look at those changes, and the obedience to authority. A lot of there was a big religious influence in schools of nursing. So that sort of diminishing of the influence of Christianity, church attendance. The whole social order changed. Introduction of birth control in the late 60s for single women. Thank you, Geertje. Yeah.